corridors between the different areas?
I think, to be completely honest, it needs to be done. And I think in time, when you get dogs just breaking out these areas, which is quite infrequent, it's not necessarily happening every year. If you're on Pelosi, you might go for a year where nothing happens. And that was one of the limitations of our work as well. We only had a very limited number of points because there weren't dogs breaking out as frequently as we initially anticipated. It does need to be done. If just from our NGO point of view, we've got enough data that we feel we can actually work on and trying to make a change conservation-wise on the ground. But I think, you can never stop analysing. Taking Tembe into account, for example, that potential transfrontier opportunity, it's enormous. It really does need to be looked at. But for us, my personal interest is trying to make something work on the ground as opposed to constantly reanalyzing. There's definitely scope for it there.
You can do it in 2 seconds.
Now, just what the reason why Tembe came up as unsuitable for corridor?
Well, particularly over here, because a lot of the dogs weren't following those areas, so the habitat is quite different. They were following areas that were obviously full of prey in those areas. What I suspect is that Tembe's obviously got very different habitat. If you're looking at those sort of grassland areas and they're looking at sand forests, that's not represented in that Zululand area at all. So that's where that modelling is a little bit tricky as well. It's not really showing exactly what your opportunity is. I'm saying that dogs are habitat generalists, and they probably would happily go through there. And the model is very limited in that regard. And that is showing you essentially what you kind of know already based on the data that you have. It is something. So if there's a better modelling technique that comes out in the future, that can actually maybe if we had prey information, for example, that could change quite significantly.
Fantastic, thanks, Robyn. We need to move on. We're going to move on to Robyn, who's going to be chatting about basically what drives where and how big of an area subordinates dispersing subadults use. Thanks.
Thanks, Adrian. So white rhinos go through several stages throughout their lives. When they are young, they travel with their mothers throughout her home range, up to about 2.5 years when their mother is expecting a new calf. At that point, they are sort of picked away to go out wide world by themselves, and they enter a stage of subadult exploration. So this is when the males and the females, the subadults, link up with each other, and they link up with other females throughout the reserve, and they move with these females for several weeks or several months within these females' home ranges. And so in doing this, they get a good idea of the kind of environment that they have access to, the kind of places that they can set up home when it's time for them to do that. So at about 7.5 years of age, when the females are expecting their first calf, they set up a home range area. And it's a bit later for males. Males at about between 10 and 12 years, they set up their home ranges. So it's just sort of the area that they call home, the area in which they move in. And when these males set up their home ranges, they're known as subordinate males. So basically, they are tolerated within other males' territories, and they also overlap one another and overlap the females' home ranges. And then a bit later on in life, they'll become territorial and create their own territories, which are then mutually exclusive with other males' territories. So when they set up these home ranges and these territories, this is a long-term setting up. We're talking about several years here, so they need to ensure that they have enough resources wherever they set up to last them for a long time. It's not just setting up for one breeding season or one certain time. It's over a long period of time. And conventional rhino theory states that basically only the territorial males are meant to be the ones that breed. Territories are set up specifically to have access to females, and so it was thought that only territorial males are the breeding males. However, a recent MSc thesis is actually has challenged this idea, and what they did was a genetic study looking at the parentage of offspring in a population, and found that quite a large proportion of the individuals of the offspring are actually from subordinate males and not necessarily from territorial males. And so what we call this as sneaky copulations. So when these subordinate males get in there when they can and mate with the females and pass on their genes. So with this in mind, we asked 2 research questions. And our study was in Natal Game Reserve, and we were looking at where do these subordinate males settle, where do they set up these home ranges, and basically we expect they have the potential to settle anywhere because of the spatial knowledge that they have. However, we do need to find, do they go in specifically one area or are they spread throughout the park? Secondly, we're asking, and this is our more key question, what influences the size of these home ranges? So Thank you. So in terms of the size of the home range, we looked at 3 variables. This was habitat quality, male density, and female home range overlap. In terms of habitat quality, we looked at habitat quality in the dry season. This is really the crunch time where forage is limiting. So if this played a role, it would have played a role in the dry season. And we use crude protein as a measure of habitat quality because this has been known to play an important role in where the females set up their home ranges and how they shift these home ranges seasonally. And a lot of the rhino literature shows us that although rhinos are large-bodied non-ruminants, they still need a very high-quality forage, and so we think that perhaps foraging could play a role in determining how large these home ranges are. With this in mind, we then predicted that in low-quality habitats, we're going to find larger male home ranges, and vice versa. When there's a very good quality habitat, these home ranges don't necessarily need to be as large, so they can be smaller. In terms of male density, we are expecting sort of a twofold impact here. One with competition between other subordinate males. So when you have lots of rhinos packed into one area, they're going to be fighting for different resources. We also have competition effects and tolerance effects with the territorial males. Because these territorial males tolerate the subordinate males within their territories, they're not going to want to tolerate an infinite number, maybe 1 or 2. So basically, when there's very high density, quite logically what we expect is that home ranges are going to be a lot smaller, so they don't have to overlap too much. And finally, when we look at access to females, this is where this idea of sneaky copulations come in, because if these males want to get their genes passed on and they want to have a greater chance of reproductive success, they want to be where the females are. So they're going to set up the home ranges with this in mind. They're going to set up with an access to females. So what we predict is that for females, we're going to find larger home ranges. Just quickly, my methods were, I was working in a Atala game reserve, and I used sighting data that was collected by the Atala management staff to create male home ranges in a GIS system. For the habitat quality data, Van Rooyen created a vegetation map of Atala game reserve, and Hebbelman then broke these 27 different vegetation types, which you can see on screen, into 7 vegetation types which are relevant for white rhino foraging, and then she also found the crude protein values for these. So that is the data I was using as my habitat quality data. And then also Hebbelman created female home ranges as part of her study, and so these are the female home ranges I'm using to overlap onto the males. So if we look at the distribution of rhinos, this shows us where we find the female rhinos throughout Atala Game Reserve. The pink areas are where all the females can be found, and as we can see, there's quite a general distribution throughout the whole park. The green areas are where you wouldn't find sort of rhinos in general, and this is because it's quite uninhabitable. It's either very thick, dense vegetation, or very steep gradients. As you can see, there's a river there, and it's a huge sort of gradient, so you just wouldn't find rhinos in these areas. So when we look at the distribution of males to determine where they settle, each one of these bright blobs represents a male's home range. And what we see is that it's scattered throughout the park. They don't prefer one particular area or one particular size, or side, sorry. So basically they are scattered and they settle all over the place. If we're looking at the size, what you can see here, just to give you an indication of the kinds of sizes that we find here, this is just 5 of the home ranges that are generated, and you can see there's quite a variability. The purple one's quite small and the green one's quite large, basically. So to determine what factor influences size the most, we're just going to run a simple multiple regression, putting in habitat quality, female home range overlap, and male density. However, when we started investigating the data, we found quite an interesting trend. We found a very strong positive correlation between male density and female home range overlap. So what we see is where there's a high female overlap, there's a very high density of males, which makes a lot of sense because the guys want to be where the girls are, right? And this is important and it'll come in later, but for now, this correlation avoided me doing one single multiple regression. So we broke our analysis up into 2 multiple regressions, one looking at density and habitat quality, and the other one at female overlap and habitat quality. So for the first one here, we see that density plays a significant role in determining the size of these home ranges, and habitat quality does not seem to be playing a significant role. So if we investigate this a little bit further, what we find is that when you get a very high density, male home ranges become smaller, which makes sense. It's what we expected because of these effects of competition and territoriality and being tolerated by the territorial males. In the second multiple regression, we looked at female overlap and habitat quality, and what we find is that female overlap played an important role in determining the size of these home ranges, and again, habitat quality did not seem to play a role. So when we look at this relationship, what we see is when there's higher female overlap, home ranges are actually smaller, and when there's a lower female overlap, home ranges are larger. This is kind of contrary to what we were expecting, but if you remember that relationship between female home range overlap and density, males want to be where the females are, so it's going to cause a very high density, and this is what constrains these home range sizes. So what we expect is these males want to have the hugest home ranges they can, but they are constrained or limited by the density effect. So if we just go back to these multiple regressions, we can look at the standardized coefficients to determine which factor played the most important role. And what we see here is that female overlap played the most important role in determining home range size, and density played a secondary role. And again, habitat quality did not seem to play a role, but this isn't necessarily surprising, as these male home ranges are not about access to food. As we know, white rhinos are grazers, and grass is a very abundant food source. It's also a food source that's very hard to defend, considering you get lots of other grazers. So these home ranges are not about access to food, but they're about access to females. And this is where we believe this idea of sneaky copulations come in, because these males want to be where the females are to get in mating when they get the chance. And what we find then is that density limits size. So if we look at this idea of sneaky copulations, this goes against a lot of the rhino theory that we've known in the past. And we expect that territorial males are meant to be the reproductively active ones, and this is going against that literature. Unfortunately, we don't have DNA evidence in a Natal game reserve yet, but hopefully in future we'll be able to get a bit more and understand this a bit more. But for now, we need to consider this idea of sneaky copulations in reserve management when you're removing individuals that might now actually be reproductively active. So if we just consider the scenario for a second, this map here shows the territorial males, and these are territories throughout Natal Game Reserve. And if you consider male A in his territory, because of the idea and the way territories work, these males are not going to venture out of their sort of area. So they only have access to females that they get overlapping females there. So they can only therefore pass their genes on to one side of the park. If, however, we have male A who has a son, an offspring, and he moves and settles on the other side of the park, due to the sneaky copulations, he could be passing on his genes to other females in which male A did not necessarily have a chance to access these females. And so these genes are being shifted around the park, which creates greater heterogeneity. So this is just an example of how this kind of system may work, and it might be useful to look into this in future with sort of DNA analysis to look at the parentage to see if this actually is the situation. And that is that.
Okay, well, Robyn raced through that. We have a bit of time. Are there any questions? We've got quite a bit of time for questions.
I'm led to believe that the whole mating process is a long, drawn-out affair. How would the other males then